Welcome back to the third video in week 10 of HI2009, and in this video we're entering the grey zone. We're returning to earlier ideas about defining war and seeing how that is difficult in the 21st century. We're picking up on ideas of changing battlefields and of a changing role for the army, which we picked up a little bit in the first video this week. So let's go to the grey zone. And here we can extend some of those ideas that Hallam introduced about the significance of technology in warfare. It's worth returning to ideas of quite what war is. And in the grey zone, war and diplomacy and other forms of coercion become murky. That's why it's a grey zone. In the first week of the subject, Nick Bozio tried to sort these matters out into clear categories and to stop everything being called war. And while that's a useful aim, and one that we've taken advantage of with his schema of what constitutes war, in the present, I think it's useful to be aware of hostile actions by states that might not involve physical violence. In his book, War Transformed, Mick Ryan discusses the nature of war versus the character of war. The nature of war, as in Bozio's schema, is simple. War is violence driven by politics. We can see those elements that Bozio has identified as essential emerging again. War has to be reciprocal. There has to be opponents for something to be a war, and they have to be politically opposed. Part of this is that war needs to be waged between identifiable groups, and this is where things start to break down in the grey zone. And they start to break down in part because of cost. Conventional wars are extremely costly, and the cost of war has had a massive impact on politics for centuries. One of the things I remember from my brushes with early modern history is how states and monarchs have been unsettled by the need to increase taxes in order to pay for their wars. But in the present, effective hostile action against identifiable groups doesn't need to involve conventional weapons. And that brings us into this idea of the character of war, which is, as Mick Ryan says, constantly changing. Different tools, different approaches are used in order to inflict violence on an opposing group, and it doesn't necessarily need to be physical violence, although it is often possible to inflict damage which works its way through a system to be resolved in ways that are detrimental to the lives or health of the target population. So while bankrupting a nation or damaging its infrastructure might not cause death directly, those actions can cause death indirectly, and the reach of large organizations into people's everyday lives has become quite extraordinary. Targeted advertising through the social media giants and the algorithms that control what information is presented to social media users can influence decisions quite effectively, can lead to changes of government through democratic processes, and can be seen as an attack on groups of people that end up having tangible outcomes. And in that blog post by Robertson, which is in the further reading list, there is discussion about what grey zone conflict might look like. Even in conventional war, there can be some murkiness about quite who's involved, quite what's going on, but you can still generally identify a theatre of war, and generally there's direct violence using weapons. Grey zone conflict involves less direct violence, but it's still violence being promoted by states or by other political entities. And it's still intended to coerce another group. And there will be a great deal of this conflict going on that is invisible to non-participants and perhaps even to the group under attack. As a result, it undermines that dichotomy between the armed forces and civilian life And if you can be under attack because of your political beliefs but not even know that you're under attack, it also undermines the difference between war and peace. And grey zone conflict can be extremely cheap and extremely effective. And these attacks have certainly occurred. For example, the 2010 viral worm attack by probably Israel on Iranian nuclear facilities destroyed equipment in those labs. While difficult to orchestrate, that particular attack was still cheaper than attack using conventional weapons, could not lead to the same retaliation that direct conventional weapon attack would have done, and was extremely effective in setting back the Iranian nuclear program. You can see why grey zone techniques are extremely appealing to states, and in part it is reducing the cost of warfare. But it's possible to argue that these techniques, in some form, have always formed part of war. I've included an image of a cat on the slide, not because I like cats, but to show the ways in which war involves, and has long involved, techniques of persuasion that extend beyond violence. After the Russian attack on Ukraine, the Ukrainian propaganda that has been sent to Western nations has been extraordinarily good, and among it are lots of images of cats because in themselves they send a useful message. Their message is about the disruption to everyday people who we can identify with, and about the impact of this war on the innocent. The Ukrainian propaganda needs to be very good because it needs Western allies to continue to send it expensive weapons and to support it in a struggle against a major power, and a major power with significant energy resources. Ukrainian propaganda is perhaps an obvious use of social media and an influencing opinion in a way that benefits those doing so. I'm not quite sure whether or not Chloe qualifies as an implement of grey zone conflict, but it's something to remember that propaganda has long been part of war. In the first video, I spoke about the difference between total war and limited war, and the ability of state citizens to be unaware of limited war. Propaganda is a significant tool in creating a will to fight, and in the example of Ukraine, for reaching out and affecting public opinion in nations that are not directly involved in the fighting. Fortunately for us, Robertson has devoted some thought to the grey zone and has produced this list of examples of grey zone conflict. As you read through that list, you can see how difficult it can be to detect attacks by one group on another in the grey zone, and you can start to see how significant these attacks can be. You might also start to question what groups are currently at war with Australia and how far advanced hostilities already are. And it's worth considering too how states can masquerade as non-state groups within the grey zone. That states can sponsor things such as groups of hackers who attack another nation's infrastructure but retain plausible deniability because those groups don't wear uniforms and cannot necessarily be shown to be connected to the state that is actually behind the attack. It's worth working your way through that list and considering what those components might look like, and considering as well whether the uncertainty associated with attacks of this nature makes war in the present difficult to detect, just as the place of the professional army in Australia makes its connections with civilian society more tenuous. I think we can link discomfort at recognising some of these activities as part of war with the discomfort of normal Australian society in recognising the significance of its military and in connecting with a profession of arms, a profession whose purpose is inherently violent. That discomfort, though, does not excuse us from this engagement, and it does not excuse us from thinking about how war is conducted and whether war is currently in progress in the 21st century.